On this episode of Skeptiko, Alex talks with religion and mythology scholar Acharya S.
On one hand, we have these traditions and these myths and myth-making, but on the other hand, we have the same characters that we see on the landscape today that say, hey, wait a minute, maybe I can make a buck out of this. Maybe I can control things. Maybe I can make my group superior and win out over the other group, and maybe I can use these myths to do it. And I think unless we thoroughly understand that, and at the same time thoroughly understand or appreciate the possibility that there is some genuine non-biological robot spiritual experience, until all that's on the table, then we can't really separate it out either.
So this mythicism or mythicist position that I am discussing, which looks at supernatural beings in antiquity as mythical figures, not real people who landed on planet Earth and did a bunch of magic tricks. But this is really a neutral position because you don't have to believe in it and you don't have to dismiss it. You don't have to be a theist or an atheist. You can be either one. You can be a theist or an atheist to enjoy this information. All I'm doing is collecting religious and mythological ideas from as far back as we can tell and putting them together and showing their influences on our thinking today.
Stay with us for Skeptiko.
Welcome to Skeptiko, where we explore controversial science with leading researchers, thinkers, and their critics. I'm your host, Alex Tsakiris, and on this episode of Skeptiko, we return to the topic of religion, which is probably fair since I've been pretty hard on the atheists lately. And since I have been so hard on the atheists, I think I ought to come clean with the fact that the atheist position, that is the consciousness is an illusion, you are a biological robot nonsense, really is, at the end of the day, a reactionary position. I mean, it is born out of this religious craziness that the atheists feel like they need to push against so hard. So I think it's good in this show that we're going to again dive in and try and lay bare the whole topic of religion. At the end of the day, through all the Skeptiko shows that I've done and the many interviews I've done with Christian folks and a couple of Buddhist folks and all the rest, I come away with the conclusion that all religions are part divine spark and part Scientology hucksterism. And if you leave either one of those out, it's hard to get your arms around what's going on. Not to suggest that I have my arms around what's going on, but I think it's impossible if you don't acknowledge, number one, the divine spark, which is the atheist position, and that takes you down this path where you wind up exactly where I said. The only place you can wind up down that path is consciousness is an illusion, you are a biological robot. Because if you acknowledge anything else other than biological robot, then you have to leave open the possibility of divine spark, because it's so widely reported across so many cultures and across all time. If you open up that door, I think you have to walk through it. Of course, on the other side, and this is what we're going to explore today in this interview with Acharya S., I think it's vital that we really examine the hucksterism, the myth-making that is a natural part of any religion. And I say it's a natural part because it does seem to me that we as human beings have this need to, one, kind of engage in this cultish behavior, and number two, try and take advantage of the fact that people like to engage in this cultish behavior. So when we see the goofiness of Mormonism or the craziness of Scientology, it really shouldn't be surprising. But what probably is surprising is when we look back and we turn back history and we go all the way back. In this show, we're going to talk a lot about the early first century, early Christian history. We find the exact same kind of pattern being repeated. And I think if we're fair and open-minded, then we have to start asking the hard question. How much of the religions that we know today, that we accept, that we dance around carefully, not to offend anyone, how much of those religions, when we really strip away and look at them honestly, are probably much more traceable to the Scientology hucksterism kind of camp than the divine spark? So that's what I'm interested in exploring, and I think I found a great guest to do it with, and that would be Acharya S. Here's the interview. Today we welcome Acharya S. to Skeptiko. Acharya, whose real name is D.M. Murdock, is a first-rate biblical scholar, an expert in religious studies and mythology, and also the author of numerous books, including The Christ Conspiracy, Who is Jesus?, and Sons of God. She also runs a website that is absolutely chock full of high-quality articles and research on the topics we're going to talk about today. That website is at truthbeknown.com. Acharya, it's great to have you on Skeptiko. Thanks so much for joining me.
Well, it's nice to be here, Alex. Thanks for inviting me. I also have a blog at freethoughtnation.com. And in fact, you can search across my websites because it has another one, stellarhousepublishing.com. But if you can search across all my websites and a forum. People are invited to ask questions of me in the forum as well.
Great. I'm going to look forward to joining your forum after I publish this because I think it's going to be interesting. Hopefully we'll touch on some things that aren't entirely consistent with everything you've talked about before and maybe get some interesting dialogue going on there. I say that because one of the reasons that I was especially grateful for you accepting this invitation is because we did have a chance to talk a little bit about my skepticism of some of the new atheism dogma when it comes to science. We were able in our dialogue email exchange beforehand to really separate that and say, from my position, Acharya, I'm very open-minded to much of what you've researched, appreciative of much of what you've researched, and that is separating out mythology, religious dogma from history. Because as we talked about, I think it's one thing to say, like I have come to understand through my research, that it is possible, perhaps, that people might be having genuine spiritual experiences, and that's my belief. That doesn't have to be your belief. And separate that out from the fact that we also have to observe and deal with the fact that people seem to have this tendency to do this cultish, myth-making, crazy stuff, and it's going on in our contemporary society, and it goes on in just about every part of history we can look at. So I think it's very worthwhile to do the kind of work that you've done to look back and try and sort through this history and to the best we can figure out where the data really points us in terms of what's historically accurate and what isn't, if you know what I mean.
I do. I think we're on a similar page because I've tried to clarify that my work is not atheistic per se, in that I'm just trying to debunk the concept of God or gods. And that's a whole different field that other people are engaged in, like the Dawkins and Hitchens Harris group. And they like to debate the existence of God, whereas I don't call myself a theist or an atheist, would prefer not to have a label, obviously, and I don't disbelieve or believe. I just think what I consider to be appropriate thoughts in any given moment. And I like to give this example. When something horrible happens to a small child, I think it's appropriate to ask yourself, you don't have to say it out loud, but in your own mind, to say, where's the good God in all this, supposed to be in charge of everything, allowing this child to die horribly? I think that's an entirely appropriate thought to have. And you can even say it out loud, as far as I'm concerned. So that's an atheistic type thought. But then if you want to go up onto a mountain and look over a gorgeous valley, have the sun shining down on you, and you feel like having some kind of cosmic communion and want to call that an experience with God, I think that's also appropriate and entirely up to the individual. So I'm not pushing here some kind of dogma or doctrine of what you must believe in. I like to say that the thoughts that are in your own mind are your own business. It's none of my business to be inside your brain to tell you what to think at any given moment. That's what religions try to do. There's a lot of mind control, right? They threaten you with hell and promise you heaven if you think a certain way. And this concept of mind control is taken even to a greater extent by claiming that there's a giant being called God who's separate and apart from humanity, but omniscient. So he's really inside your head. And there's even certain cults that say that you're connected in a network to this giant being, but not in a good way, not in a spiritual experience, more in an enslaving way. You're just a manipulated puppet, according to that mentality. So, but there are spiritual experiences that do have a profound effect on people, and it can be long lasting. It can change someone completely and dramatically. And I don't have any problem with those concepts or those experiences. I've experienced mystical things in my past intentionally to see what a particular religion, sect, or cult is all about, a doctrine, a dogma, whatever. I've actually done a lot of meditation, and I've gone to groups where I've done like out of body work, all this kind of stuff, to see what mankind's extremely ancient religious traditions have meant to humanity. You can't really understand the religious mind in order to analyze it without having gone through these experiences. I was a born-again Christian, and that was a sincere moment that actually led me to where I am now. Which brings me back to what you were trying to differentiate between, which is this notion of spirituality being a private domain of an individual, and what has actually happened in the third dimension, in physical reality. These are separate issues.
Well, I don't know that I'd quite go there, since you said that that's what I said, because I totally agree with you in terms of someone's private thoughts are their own business. They're no one's business. But I think that the new atheists have a point here, although the point cuts both ways, and that's that to the extent that our private beliefs work their way into our stated beliefs, our stated values, and how we exercise those beliefs and values in terms of laws we create and how we want to move society in one direction or another, it is our business. So
sure.
I'm interested, as you are, although I think we might have different conclusions about that, but probably not that different, how we conceptualize some of this information that we're going to talk about history and what that means for us. So, I think there's kind of two different discussions we can have there, but where I really want to get eventually is I want to hit the middle ground, because I think what has happened in this debate, this culture war debate over science versus religion, whether we wanted the debate to go this way or not, it's become polarized, like all these debates do. And I think we have, these fundamentalist Christians, fundamentalist Muslims, fundamentalist Jewish people, take your pick, and they're on one side, and they're throwing out Bible verses or sacred texts, or they're talking about Armageddon or whatever crazy stuff they are. And the most people are looking at that and going, hey, that's not me. I can't buy into that.
Right.
But on the other hand, and I think sometimes the atheist community doesn't realize that sometimes the atheists come across as wacky, when they're telling us that we're biological robots and life is meaningless and you have no free will. And the majority of people are sitting there and going, I know that's bull too, and they're trying to sort out something between these two extremist positions. And what I see you doing is, in a very sober, scholarly way, going back and saying, okay, I know my position isn't very popular here, in saying I'm going to openly consider the possibility that Jesus was a myth and that it looks more like other myths of the time. I know that isn't popular, but I'm going to go and sort through the best historical data and try and lay that bare. That's the kind of stuff I think more people in the middle need to open themselves up to and say, hey, I'm going to take that in. I don't know exactly what I'm going to do with it, but I'm just going to kind of take it in. And I'm going to take it in, not saying that has to lead me towards atheism or that I have to do this or that. I'm just going to take it in and see what happens.
Right. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to distinguish. That's what I meant when I say what's happening in the privacy of your own mind. Of course, I always qualify that by saying it's not my business until it spills out deleteriously onto others. So, if you can sit there and think of some glorious concept in your brain, but if you can keep it there without insisting and imposing it on the rest of us through all kinds of means that we've seen, and this is part of my work, is separating the pathological chaff from the wheat of man's religious traditions. Or another metaphor I like to use is the trimming of man's religious tree, which has deep roots going back thousands of years, but there's these pathological dead ends that need to be cut away for it to really blossom thoroughly. And so that's basically what I'm doing. I'm not telling people what to believe or what to disbelieve. I'm analyzing what has really happened on Earth, and if it didn't happen on Earth, what does it mean? Because we know, if we look back at the world's religions around the globe, they're now considered mythology by many people because of the teachings of Christianity, for example, or Islam or Judaism, these three monotheistic Abrahamic cultist expressions. They're telling us that everything else is a myth. So you're looking at the cultures of Rome, Greece, Europe, Central America, Asia, of course, India, all these myths, lots of parts of Africa, all their religions are all myths. Okay, so that's what these monotheistic cults are trying to tell us, of course. So we want to look back at those myths and figure out what do they mean, and since they're myths, why are the supernatural tales of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam not myths? And so I'm looking at those other supernatural tales, and I'm saying, you know what? These are myths, and they're traceable to the pre-Christian, pre-Judaic, pre-Islamic world. And what do they mean? Why were they told? Why were they created? What do these personifications represent? We have personifications of clearly supernatural beings that, in my mind, can be demonstrated to be mythological.
Let me stop you there because you've kind of wandered into this topic that I think is an important one, and I think it also comes up again and again in your work in, I think, a very convincing and important way. And that's to maybe restate what you just did, is that one of the ways to test the claim that gets made by folks who are, a lot of times, are pretty secular folks, who are just kind of going through life but are trying to fit their worldview in with the common culture, and they'll say things like, Christianity has done a lot of good through the age. Or sometimes what you'll hear is that even among secular people, that Jesus is a model of a good teacher. We may not accept the Bible, that it's inerrant, that it's perfect, but we can accept Jesus and that he was a model for kind of how we should be. And I think what your work does, you kind of go right to the heart of some of those claims. Like you just talked about, one of the claims that kind of slips in there a lot of times is this idea that Christianity is somehow special, somehow unique, that this moment, and you'll hear Christians say that this moment in time was really special, and what happened during Jesus' life never happened before in history. And I think you have some really strong evidence that just directly refutes that, just kind of blows that out of the water. And I think that's a really important point. And I think part of that is what you're talking about with the pre-Christian cross, but I think part of it is also what you just talked about, and I hope you can go into it in more depth, is that when you really dig into Christian doctrine, we see patterns that are being repeated over and over again. And of course, we can say the same thing about Islam. We can say the same thing about Judaism. It's not just that we're picking on the Christians, but let's pick on the Christians since it's such a dominant force in our culture. So do you want to pick up on that thread?
Sure. Well, first of all, I don't really pick on people.
That's my word. Okay. Okay. I hear you. Right.
No, but I have to make this clarification because when I critique Islam, invariably someone will say, you're bashing Muslims. And that is just completely fallacious. If we are criticizing Christianity, are we bashing Christians? No. In fact, we're analyzing an ideology. We're not abusing the people who follow it, unless, of course, they're behaving badly, and then we can say something about that as an individual issue. But to analyze an ideology and see its flaws is important. It's not picking on someone or bashing or abusing. It's important. It's important because the blind following of that ideology, in this case Christianity, has caused immense suffering. So when we say Christianity has brought this and that and this and that, you might be able to find a few seeds in the bag of dog poo, but you might as well just go buy a big bag of seeds instead of trying to pick through the other. We need something new and fresh and different.
Yeah, maybe, but it's the usual sidetrack, throwing mud across the street at each other kind of thing. I've been in that debate. I know you've been in that debate. Rather than saying, okay, let's look at this claim that Christianity is something special in history and that it happened, that this part of history was never repeated.
Sure. I've been picking apart the gospel story and its various components for decades now, and I've pretty much taken every element of it and shown the vast majority of it anyway. There may be a few details here and there that we're required to weave the story together, but I've shown that basically what the writers of the story have done has taken numerous elements from pre-Christian religion and mythology, from Greece, Italy, of course, the Romans, Egypt, and other parts, India even, other parts of the known world at the time, the Mediterranean, which had a very large amount of cultural exchange going on for thousands of years. And in fact, one of the major ways of disseminating religious ideas was through the wine trade, and that becomes a really huge factor in this. That's a story for another subject, but all those wine elements, Jesus' blood as the blood of the grape, the communion where drinking wine is his blood and so forth, all of that wine emphasis is traceable to the Dionysian cult, which should not surprise us if anybody knows anything about Dionysus. In fact, it's practically lifted right out of Dionysus worship. That would be one aspect of looking at the elements of the gospel story and finding their precedent in pre-Christian mythology. One of the reasons I like to do this also is part of this trimming of pathological branches on the world's great religious tree is that these earlier renditions actually had a sensible reason for a lot of these mythical motifs. And their culture has been basically usurped, dominated, destroyed, had its myths and religious traditions ripped off and repackaged. And many people are completely oblivious to ancient religion and mythology because of the bias and bigotry of Christianity, if we're going to speak about that.
Give us some examples that people could really wrap their arms around.
Well, yeah, I was telling you about the business about wine, because wine, of course, was the blood of Dionysus before it became the blood of Jesus. So that's a pretty important the main element. The blood of Christ is not original to Christianity. Then we have the pre-Christian God on the cross, and this long study I've done, 35 pages or something, like 40 pages of figures in cruciform, meaning that they're either hung on a cross or in cross shape, and in between two thieves. In fact, this is a solar symbol. There are many impressions of a divine figure in the center between two other elements. They generally are humans or anthropomorphized. So that there's this trio of images. And that is a solar symbol. The image in the center, the cross in the middle, is the sun in its totality. And then on either side is the sun in the morning and the sun in the evening, also interpreted as the sun as it goes towards the vernal equinox, the sun as it goes towards the winter solstice and the summer solstice. It could also be the equinoxes, but it's a very solar symbol. This cross with two crosses on either side. You can find this going back thousands of years in some form or another.
And in your book, you actually have reproduced photographs of relics. And what is the evidence that we have of that, the evidence that you present there?
Yeah, I have both photographs and line drawings of artifacts. I have a lot of them in here showing different cross shapes from before the Common Era or into the Common Era, but having nothing to do with Christianity. There's one thing people must understand, that when we say the turn of the Common Era, which other people call Christian era, which would be the BC, BCE, AD, CE timeline, just because something is after that artificially created timeline does not mean that it's automatically influenced by Christianity. There are still places in the world today, 2,000 years later, that have never heard of Christianity. There's like 100 untouched tribes, uncontacted tribes around the world. They've never heard of Christianity. They are living in pre-Christian times then. So just because something came after that dividing line does not mean that it was influenced by Christianity. We have crucifixes that are post-Common Era, and they're clearly not influenced by Christianity. So this is not, but we have also all these other images of gods and heroes or other sacred figures or legends or whatever in cruciform or hanging on a cross using the same words as Christ's crucifixion, the same Greek words. I have a lot of analysis in original languages in my work because I read a dozen or more languages. So that's an important aspect that you can't get in a lot of other writings on these subjects.
You know, you also make a point related to this that I was hoping you could kind of expound on a little bit, and that's that even very early on, first century, if you will, there's this myth-making going on, and some of the other religious groups are kind of complaining to the Christians, and the Christians are dialoguing back with them, and it kind of creates an interesting kind of a window into how this whole process is happening. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Right. I think you're thinking of Justin Martyr when he is addressing the polemics against Christianity. That would be in the 2nd century when Christianity really starts to become known to the outside world, so to speak. And Justin Martyr was an early church father around 150 who had to address some of the complaints of his unbelieving friends. And in his first apology, he has a section, chapter 1, called The Analogies to the History of Christ. He really just admits against interest, left and right, talking about how Jesus' death and resurrection and virgin birth and so forth, he is expounding nothing different from what the pagans believed regarding those whom they esteemed sons of Jupiter.
Right. I'm no worse than you guys. I mean, that's the defense.
Yeah, it is. He's basically saying that we propound nothing different from the pagan belief system. So why are you making fun of me? And you do find this throughout the second and third centuries, where the Christian defenders are constantly admitting that their ridiculous beliefs are no more ridiculous than the ridiculous beliefs of the pagans. And so it's kind of like, a battle between people who like Superman and people who like Spider-Man. And they're like, having this big battle. And of course, the people who like the Judeo-Christian Superman are the ones who won out. And that's a whole other story.
But I think this is really one of the most compelling parts of your work, is that no matter how you come out and sort everything out at the very end, one of the things you clearly establish is this idea we have of, quote unquote, the early Christians is dramatic. History tells us that it's dramatically different than what we've come to believe. And that, for example, you touched on a couple of things there that I want to get back to. I want to get back to Josephus and who he was, why we might not take what we think we know about him and swallow that whole, so maybe you can touch on that. But I also want to talk about Paul, because, of course, Paul is really the person responsible for the Christian church as we know it. And but in particular, to get back to this point that I was raising about your work, is who is Paul writing these letters to? Because I think most Christians just kind of accept that there's all these Christian churches that are formed and Paul is running around to them and all that. But that's not really the case, is it?
So in this Pre-Christian God on a Cross ebook that I have on my website, stellarhousepublishing.com, you can get it. I'm also discussing the Orphic Dionysian cult that was extremely popular. I touched on it as it spread with the wine production. Wine was very popular and very important all around the Mediterranean, a major part of the economy, as it is today. Part of this Orphic Dionysus proselytizing required, and it tells the legend of Orpheus, who was not a real person, but there may have been, there were many people going around the Mediterranean proselytizing the cult of Dionysus. But Orpheus is a fictional demigod character. And oddly enough, he is depicted as going around almost the same places where Paul is depicted as going to proselytize the word of Bacchus or Dionysus. So Orpheus is depicted, it's like they just took the story of Orpheus and reworked it as Paul. Was there a historical Paul? Yes, there was somebody who wrote those letters, but the character in the New Testament is another fictional compilation of characters. In this case, there would be a person doing this proselytizing, but he is buried in with the acts of Orpheus, elements out of Josephus, possibly the Saul of Josephus, in fact, and other individuals, other figures. So we have a kind of compilation in our impression of what Paul was. And these letters may have been a kind of standard proselytizing formula that was being taught at mystery schools. These places where he goes to in the story, Ephesus and along the Levant, in the Levant and Turkey, Asia Minor area, these have brotherhood seats or schools there for centuries. So basically what we're seeing when he's addressing the so-called churches is he's addressing these brotherhood centers that are already in existence and had been for a long time. And those texts are reworked. There's a lot of Gnosticism in them. The Pauline epistles are reworked to give it a more dense appearance of historicity, whereas he could be talking about ideas that were already in place. There's no need for a historical founder of what he's talking about. There are all these epithets for divine beings that they use, like soter, which means savior, or healer, or any of these ideas, any of these epithets that Jesus is called by, king, prince, lord. These were all applied to pre-Christian gods all over the place. So when you have someone proselytizing, invoking a being by these epithets, it does not immediately indicate it's Christianity, or that it's a real person they're talking about, or that it was a historical founder. If you're saying the Lord did this and that, in pre-Christian times, you would be talking about possibly Yahweh in the Bible. You'd be talking about Zeus. You'd be talking about Dionysus. Everybody was called the Lord. All over the Levant, where the Old Testament draws its mythology from, the gods all over there are called Lord. There's Lord Baal, and there's just so many of them. And in fact, if you go back to these Canaanite texts, such as at Ras Shamra, the Ugaritic text, you'll find a whole pile of what are considered to be Christian motifs and elements in there. There's a God the Father, that's the god El. There's a Virgin Mother, her name is Anat. And there's a Son of God who dies and resurrects from the dead. His name is Baal. He's a fertility god.
And then speak to for a minute, because I take two things out of what you're saying, is even if someone isn't convinced of the Jesus is a myth, I think the very least one has to take away from this research, and they really need to pick up this book and or go to the website Truth Be Known and really look at the extent to which you document this and the numerous scholars that are on board with what you've said and the rigor that you put into documenting this from numerous sources in a very scholarly way. But what I was getting back to is saying, the very least I think someone has to come to is say, wow, this picture that's emerging of this period of time when Christianity was supposed to form is definitely a lot different than I thought it was. Because
Absolutely.
What we walk away with is it seeped into our culture. Even people who are not Christian have this idea that boom, this religion sprung up organically because there was this important historical figure that was unlike anyone who ever came before, and everyone just kind of gravitated around his ideas, and this religion was formed. So whether or not you believe in a historical Jesus, that myth that I just said, I think is blown apart by what you're just talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. That is a really incomplete picture of the world. And that's part of what motivates me, because these ancient cultures have been unfairly derogated and buried and hidden from sight. And to me, what I'm digging up, I've always been a digger. I started 2 years old. I was fascinated with digging in the ground. So I actually did archaeological excavation. But this kind of work to me is also excavation and digging. And it's very exciting to find, like what I just told you about, the God the Father, Virgin Mother, and dying and rising Son of God in the ancient Ugaritic texts. It's very exciting to me to find this information. Right. I'm not threatened by it at all. I find it fascinating. And I think it's important. It restores humanity to these other cultures as well. And the only way that we could have been so ignorant to believe in that fictional tale of the great dawning of divine revelation upon this people, in the dark world all surrounding them. It's so fake. The only way that could be promulgated is to force people to be ignorant of the religion and mythology in pre-Christian times in the appropriate areas. You have to bury that information. You have to drive people away from it. You have to force them not to be interested in it. Also, physically, there was a massive amount of destruction of these artifacts to keep this information from leaking out, burying up, covering up. They would build churches over temples, pagan temples, so that no one would ever see those temples again. And to add it gets even worse. They would move deranged, crazy monks in there to live on the temple sites, the pagan temple sites, and to actually physically abuse them by defecating on them. And so this was how our great religious traditions that apply to numerous cultures, the cultural loss is enormous.
And if we take a step back and if we try and bring it into modern day times, we have a well-documented history of how that happens, and how that, if we're going to promote our own interests in our own culture, we eventually get to this hard decision that we make, that the best way to do that is to just steamroll over everyone else's culture. So in a way, in a very cold analytical way of looking at it, the picture you paint makes a lot of sense in terms of what we know about how we work and how societies advance. Let's just pick up on a couple of little examples of what you're talking about in terms of this obfuscation of history, rewriting of history, because you mentioned Josephus a minute ago. Tell us who Josephus is and what we, quote-unquote, know about Josephus' writing on Jesus.
Well, Josephus was a Jewish historian. He was a general, actually, first, of the first century, whose major works were composed around 90-100 AD. And in them appears the infamous Testimonium Flavianum, is a short passage that abruptly interrupts the surrounding texts and briefly introduces Jesus Christ in a very short statement of faith, essentially, that he was the Messiah and he still has followers and blah, blah, blah. Everybody knows this is so infamous, should I say.
Right, because when you run across Christians, and this just happened to me the other day, I was out in the soccer field with my daughter, and this person comes up, and we start engaging in this conversation a little bit. I don't normally get into these things, but a little bit. And one of the first things this person said was Josephus. Hey, we're Christians. Part of the reason we know that Jesus is real is this ancient historical text, Josephus. He was a Roman, and he even acknowledges that Jesus lived. So for anyone who doesn't know, this is a common apologetic kind of cornerstone of the whole Jesus thing. So I'm sorry, please continue.
Right. So I've written pretty extensively on this subject. I have a page, I have a full draft of a book that on the Josephus issue alone, but it's it's going to require a while. Every time I write something like this, you can imagine it takes me forever. But because it's heavy-duty stuff, I'm analyzing Greek. On my Free Thought Nation, if you go through freethoughtnation.com, if you just look up Josephus, you'll find some significant writings on this issue. And first of all, there are many reasons to claim that this is an interpolation. And I don't want to go into all those arguments of why it's an interpolation, but I am convinced, and I have shown, I believe, reasonably and scientifically, that the passage is not original to Josephus, that Josephus had never heard of this individual.
Scholars for a long time, as you point out, one of the points you make, I think that's very compelling, is to say hundreds and hundreds of years, it's kind of been accepted that this probably isn't real.
Yeah, there's the partial interpolation theory. There's a whole total interpolation, and there are people who believe the entire thing is real. The people who believe the entire thing is real are not among the scholars these days in as far as the majority goes. The majority of the common folk, so to speak, may believe that the entire thing is real, but most scholars today, even devoted Christians, will adhere to the partial interpolation theory. But previously, there had been, for at least 100, 200 years, it was accepted as a forgery because it had been thoroughly demonstrated to be such in toto. And by the beginning of the 20th century, people were writing about it as if it had been proved to be a forgery. But as I say, in any event, even if we allow that it isn't, it still does not serve as contemporary evidence of the existence of this individual.
Okay, but before you go down that path, I want to also put this in a little bit of context for people who maybe haven't dug into this as thoroughly as you have, because I can hear in your explanation you're kind of leaving room for all this detailed debate on it, which is good, but I think the big picture is it probably ain't real, folks. And one of the things that we can use to understand that is to put it in the context of all the other stuff we know that was created after the fact. I mean, one of the things I always point folks to who love to kind of rattle off scripture is, John 8. And when Jesus says, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. And I always tell people, well, look in your Bible, and I think down at the bottom of the page, you'll see a little asterisk there. And then you'll follow that asterisk, and you'll find that this, like so many things in the Bible, when we really have dug into it, have said, we're not really so sure that was really in there. And if you dig further, what they say is, that really wasn't in there.
Like the resurrection in the Gospel of Mark. This scholarship, I actually discuss a lot of this scholarship in my book, Who Was Jesus?, which does not talk about the mythology behind it very much. It just addresses the Gospels on their face. So that book is quite useful for that kind of discussion. It also talks about the other supposed witnesses or, writers from pagan antiquity like Suetonius, Tacitus, Pliny, and so forth, who supposedly serve as evidence of the existence of Jesus of Nazareth. But I analyze all of those claims, too. And I analyze the claim of whether or not there was any place called Nazareth that he could have been from.
Yeah, talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I have another article that I wrote called, it appears in our book refuting Bart Ehrman's attack on us by Frank Zindler. So we talk about Nazareth. And I go through and analyze the usages of the phrase that is now being translated, Jesus of Nazareth. And I discover that phrase really is barely in the New Testament. Most of the time they're identifying Jesus as a Nazarene, which is a pre-Christian sect, interestingly enough, of carpenters. And there's another fascinating motif that I go into detail about, this whole idea that Jesus was a carpenter. Well, unknowns to the masses, there are entire carpenter guilds with the God as a carpenter. This idea of God as a carpenter or a craftsman, God himself, a God, any God. There's gods in every culture. There's one in the Ugaritic culture. There's one in Egypt. These are craftsman gods. In Egypt, it's Ptah. It's Kothar, if I'm pronouncing that right, in the Ugaritic. So there's the carpenter god motif is also pre-Christian. When you say he's a carpenter, I analyze this word tekton. I go into practically every detail of the story. But to get back to Nazareth, right. Well, it turns out in my mind that what they're doing here is incorporating the Nazarene factor, very important group of people who are kind of hidden. A lot of these these mystery schools and sects are not overtly named in the gospel, but they're indicated by their landmarks, their artifacts that identify them. For example, this whole carpenter thing. In an instant, just by identifying him as a carpenter, you've incorporated the Nazarenes. Most of the skills in antiquity would have a god attached to them. There's the smith cult. In the Greek, we know the smith god by the name of Hephaestus. There's the mason cult. There's the carpenter cult. There's the wine cult. It goes on and on and on. This is how the ancient world looked. This is where everybody's missing the milieu, the background, when they see this divine Christian revelation concept.
And also, I think an important point you make related to that is you kind of dispel another myth, and that's that in this time period, there isn't a lot of communication between different sects and groups about these traditions, myths, whatever you want to call them. And you really kind of blow that apart. I mean, there's all sorts of information flow going back and forth about this stuff. People really care about this stuff. They talk about it. They share ideas, right?
Yeah, they weren't sitting around watching TV. If you cut out TV, you can see that there's a whole different world out there that people are going to be fascinated with, and it affects them profoundly. And it depends on where you're living. For example, the people in Northern Europe are subjected to a significant amount of darkness per year, and so the sun and coldness. And the sun to them is a magnificent savior and healer, and they rejoice every day the sun is in their presence. That would mean in the morning and at the end of the winter, especially. And of course, the winter solstice is marking the beginning of the rebirth of the new sun. A lot of people had their years, cultures had their years beginning at the winter solstice, which we celebrate as the birth of Jesus. So,
and what about these practices in India and in Egypt making their way over? I think there's always been the implication that, gosh, there's no way that anything from India could have made its way into...
You can only claim that by utter ignorance of the history of the region. For one thing, there were already Indians, the Mitanni, in the Turkey area, the Asia Minor. And there were other Indo-Europeans, the Hittites. And the Hittites made their way to what is now known as Jerusalem. They were right in the southeastern border of that area. And in fact, they're mentioned in the Bible as being the descendants of the Israelites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Jebusites. And so there's already Indo-European influence. India, the commerce between India and the West had been going on for thousands of years. As far as distances go, if you follow the genetic paradigm of humanity's exodus out of Africa, the mainstream right now is claiming, at least 70,000 years ago, human beings started migrating out of Africa, and they did it to the east. They did it up along the Nile. They did it through the Sinai Desert, and exactly the region we're talking about, where all of this stuff, Egypt, where all of this stuff, percolated for tens of thousands of years.
And in this case, we don't even need humanity per se. We don't need large numbers of people.
Right.
We need a handful of people with some ideas and books that then get transmitted to other people, and then that gets transmitted, right? And we don't need a large migration of people to have these ideas come across.
Right. In fact, what happened with many of these ideas, and again, we go back to Dionysus significantly, because within the Dionysus rituals are the death and resurrection of the god, in text before the Christian era. And the main, we would call this diffusionism of culture. It's not always the same. It's not going to be the same every time a myth hits the shores or mountains of a particular area, because as I was saying earlier, it depends on where you're located. The people in the northern Europe greeting the sun, the people in the desert regions of Arabia are not keen with the sun at all. They're sleeping during the day and they're going out at night. And so their gods are more focused at the night sky. We have a lot of lunar and stellar mythology within Islam and Judaism. And there's a lot of solar religion in the European cultures, of course. But the main diffusionists in antiquity seem to be the Phoenicians, who were named by that term by the Greeks probably about 3,000 years ago, but they existed long before that. We can call them Canaanites, Syrians, Biblians, from the town of Byblos, their city. They were in cultural exchange with Egypt for thousands of years. You're talking maybe 7,000 years ago, doing exchange back and forth with Egypt, which again is not an extraordinary concept. They're very close together in terms of mileage, and then knowing that everybody comes from up the Nile pretty much, and this going back and forth there is not that big of a deal. But there are cedars of Lebanon in Egypt that prove this exchange going on. So you have these two cultures empowering each other, and the Phoenicians, of course, became amazing sailors. They built incredible ships from these massive cedars, and they settled in the region because of the cedars, of course, and they became extremely wealthy. And they were able to sail all around the Mediterranean, and then eventually they went around the tip of Africa as well. And there are indications they made it to Great Britain and were mining the tin mines there. And then, of course, there's the whole America issue, which is a completely different show, and I won't get into that right now. But in sailing around the Mediterranean, they exchanged culture tremendously, and eventually, of course, they invented the alphabet, which, what the alphabet did for the world is mind-blowing. And so you can see that where the Phoenicians went, where their writing went, they were able to record other people's cultural details and elements, and they then take this along with them. They brought wine with them. They brought the wine cult. They brought the wine god, vine growing. This is all part of the same thing. Everything was considered to be divine. The serpent, the snake is involved in this because the serpent is seen to help the soil and the serpent was seen as a symbol of resurrection because it would go underground where people were buried, and it would come back up alive. And so they used that as a symbol. Serpent is another huge aspect. And look, Jesus is compared to the serpent that Moses raises up, the serpent, brazen serpent of bronze.
Yeah, I'm always a little bit reluctant when we start saying this is what this means and this is why that means this, but I'll kind of grant you that.
But we know these things from ancient texts, so it's not that difficult to...
Well, let's talk about that for a minute, because one of the things that we have in contemporary research is we can have people who have hallucinogenic experiences and bring up some of these same motifs that seem to come from other cultures, and we can't really explain how they did that. There's a lot more mystery to the mystery than I think we know about. But that's my hunch, and you can have a hunch that, no, we can really explain the mystery by people just interacting with their natural environment and nature, and that explains the mystery. So I don't even want to get into that debate, but I think there's a real debate to be had there. What I do want to do is address this question that I think has to be popping up in people's mind, and that is, how do you know what you know? We didn't really talk a lot about your credentials. People might be surprised to see that there isn't a PhD after your name, but as many have said, your books probably represent at least a couple of pretty darn good dissertations there if they were ever published in that form. So people need to just go and look at the body of the work, analyze the scholarship, the rigor that you use, and not worry about the letters after your name.
Well, first of all, I am an alumna, of the American School of Classical Studies at Athens, Greece, where I did excavate there, and that is a very good institution. And so my scholarship has been given, the stamp of approval. You also have to remember that great scholars like Joseph Campbell did not have a PhD. He got a master's degree, but when he started to go into a PhD program, he said, "Forget about it. You'll stifle me." Right. So I know exactly how he feels, and so that the letters after the name, they're given away by universities and colleges that started out as Christian theological seminaries. So they're not going to give me a PhD.
We've touched on so many topics. Tell folks, if they go to your website, Truth Be Known, and they find your books, what do you think is a good starting point for people? What are some of the most popular books that you have or articles that people might use to kind of shoehorn their way into this thing?
Well, there's a lot of articles for free on there that can whet appetites for various of my writings. Otherwise, I have ebooks, I have Kindle, I have some video, I've got several books. I think for a mildly Christian person who's still involved in Christianity, if they really want to know the issues with the Gospels themselves and what mainstream scholars and theologians and New Testament scholars and experts and so forth are talking about and discussing. My book, Who Was Jesus? Fingerprints of the Christ, is a CSI type analysis of this current scholarship, which finds issues with the claim that the New Testament is the inerrant Word of God. And so I quote, it's an almost all Christian bibliography in that book. John Ankerberg, Craig Blomberg, F.F. Bruce, William Lane Craig. I cite these individuals as showing they have some skeptical commentaries that people should know about. So that's a good book to start with, Who Was Jesus? For people who are still involved in Christianity to any extent. And then, of course, for people who are trying to debate with Christians, it contains a lot of factual research on that front. Then people who are interested in the astral mythology behind these ideas, my book, Sons of God, Krishna, Buddha, and Christ Unveiled, shows the solar nature of many deities and legendary heroes and so forth. And so that one is good. The Christ Conspiracy, I'm in the process of doing a revision of it. But that's my most popular book. And then there's my book called The Gospel According to Acharya S, which is a little different approach. It's a series of what essentially were rants from about 20 years ago that where I go into, what is prayer, is belief in God righteous, the abuse of women in the mainstream religions, and many different subjects that are a little more spiritual, talking about what is God and whether or not we should be following an organized religion and things like that. But that book has been very helpful to a lot of people. It's easy to read. It's thin. It kind of just helps them get away from what I call the organized cults. Anything that's trying to coerce you into believing in it is a cult in my mind. If they're dangling, promises of heaven and trying to smack you in the butt with threats of hell, it's a cult. If they're telling you that you're going to hell if you leave, you're going to hell if you don't believe, you're going to be killed if you're an apostate, any of that rubbish, it's a cult.
One of the things that your work is really important in doing, and it's something we didn't talk enough about, I think, but that's a real thorough analysis of the power and practices of cults, of cultish kind of behavior, of power formation, power manipulation, because I think unless we really come to grips with that, we can't then separate out what happened too, because on one hand we have these traditions and these myths and myth-making, but on the other hand we have the same characters that we see on the landscape today that say, hey, wait a minute, maybe I can make a buck out of this. Maybe I can control things. Maybe I can make my group superior and win out over the other group. And maybe I can use these myths to do it. And I think unless we thoroughly understand that, and at the same time thoroughly understand or appreciate the possibility that there is some genuine non-biological robot spiritual experience, until all that's on the table, then we can't really separate it out either, because then we come to the conclusion that, the Eskimos would have done it better. Well, we don't know. I mean,
no, but that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying an individual living in a particular area, just investigating the
yes, totally agree with that part.
Yeah, there's no need for organization at all. I can go up to a mountain here, and is there any kind of nature worshiping traditions with it? Maybe I'll go and look for that. But just in this way, though, and most of this has to do then with observations that cannot be controlled by others. For example, all the solar mythology. This is part of astrotheology. I have these astrotheology calendars, by the way, that have some really nice pictures and data about this kind of information. I find them, I'm not asking anybody to believe in any of it. What I'm just doing is writing a factual recitation of what has happened in these places. It's very empowering to know this stuff. And also, in the long run, what we were talking about at the beginning, we're talking like being in the middle between extremists on either side. And so this mythicism or mythicist position that I am discussing, which looks at it looks at supernatural beings in antiquity as mythical figures, not real people who landed on planet Earth and did a bunch of magic tricks. But this is really a neutral position because you don't have to believe in it and you don't have to dismiss it. You don't have to be a theist or an atheist. You can be either one. You can be a theist or an atheist to enjoy this information. All I'm doing is collecting religious and mythological ideas from as far back as we can tell, and putting them together and showing their influences on our thinking today. And so it doesn't require any kind of belief or any kind of joining or any kind of control.
Well, it's an impressive body of work. I think anyone who goes to truthbeknown.com and from there branches on to any of your work, picks up some of your books, hopefully, or bounces over to your blog on Free Thought Nation, or join the forum, and I can promise you I'm going to be on that forum after this show's published. I'd love to exchange ideas with some of the folks who follow your work, but it's been absolutely great having you on, Acharya. Thank you so much, and again, thanks for joining me on Skeptiko.
Well, Alex, I really appreciate being able to discuss this important information with someone who is erudite and thoughtful. So thank you for having me on.
Thanks again to Acharya S. for joining me today on Skeptiko. I'd like to tee up a couple of questions from this interview. The first would be the point I touched on at the beginning. How much of Christianity is divine spark, and how much is Scientology-style hucksterism? And question number 2, which is related to that question, is Christianity special? Is it different? If so, how is it special? How is it different from other religions? How is it different from the other religions that Acharya S. talks about that Christianity clearly trampled over in order to promote itself to the stature that it's enjoyed over the last 2,000 years? So a couple of questions there. Hopefully Michael can sort that down into something that looks reasonable and post that on the Skeptiko forum. By the way, the Skeptiko forum is a great place to continue this conversation, this dialogue, to answer these questions. You can click on over and join us over there. Of course, if you want to just leave a comment on the website, you can do that as well, right there at skeptiko.com. And that's Skeptiko, Skeptiko. While you're there, you can also check out our over 200 previous shows and find a Facebook and an email link to me. Well, that's going to do it for this episode. I have several interesting episodes coming up. Going to dive into the UFO topic. I have a handful of really interesting interviews that I've done, kind of driving into a very narrow but I think important little nook and cranny of that whole field. I hope you'll stay with me for all of that. But until next time, take care and bye for now.